So in this week and next week's video, I want to talk about resolution, starting today with the absolute nuts and bolts. We're going to begin with what megapixels are, where that magical number comes from. We're going to talk about what resolution, the number of megapixels you've got and what that means for your image size. Talk about the confusing issue of pixels per inch and how the same sort of megapixels can often give you bigger or smaller images. And lastly, why bigger isn't always better when it comes to having resolution. Now, as always with these videos, you know the deal. This is part of a technical fundamentals course that I've put together, all the basic bits and pieces you'll need to get started in photography. I'm bringing out one video a week covering everything from exposure to equipment to things like resolution. They come out about every Friday, hopefully. If you like what I'm doing, hit like, subscribe for notifications, stick a comment below if there's something I haven't answered, and I'll do my very best to answer it. But without further ado, let's find out all about resolution. Now let's talk about the slightly confusing world of resolution, megapixels, and sensor size. If you're new to photography, this sort of stuff can get very bewildering very quickly, particularly because resolution and megapixels tend to be bandied about as the kind of headline features of a camera. You're supposed to be wowed by the fact that a camera has got 24 million pixels, 36 million pixels, or whatever it might be. All it means is the number of actual picture sites that are on the image sensor that are themselves sensitive to light. And as we'll come on to later in more depth, bigger isn't necessarily always better. If we had a 6 megapixel sensor, so 6 million pixels, what you would have, if the image sensor was shaped like this, excuse the fact I can't draw, that's why I'm a photographer, to make up 6 million you might have, say, 2000 on the short axis and 3000 on the long axis, and so they would be divided up like that into a huge grid, much smaller than this. I'm not going to draw 6 million, don't worry. And what you would have is an enormously complicated grid system like that of 3000 pixels by 2000 pixels to make up a 6 million pixel image. Obviously, change those numbers depending on how big your sensor actually is, how many megapixels it's actually got. That's what it actually means. The more megapixels you have, the more resolution. And the more resolution, the bigger the image you can make without loss of quality. To give you an example, this compact is a 10 million pixel sensor. This SLR, my day-to-day professional workhorse, the D4, has a 16 million pixel sensor. Okay, not that big a difference in terms of numbers, you might think. 10, 16. And particularly nowadays, you've got, even my smartphone does 20 million pixels. Okay, the difference it makes in image size is this much. Straight out of the camera, with nothing being done to them in software, with no changes made, no shifting of image size, the image from the 16 million pixel D4 is this big, and the image from a 10 million pixel sensor inside this compact is this big. Okay, that's how big they are when they start. Obviously you can lose image size, you can make them smaller and there'll be no loss of quality because you're simply discarding information, making the image smaller. You can enlarge them as well. You can actually play around quite a bit. You can go up to a certain size before image quality starts to degrade quite seriously. You're also able to crop into an image, to create a different image, or to zoom in on a certain area, or simply change the shape of the shot to give you a different feel and different look. And of course, the more resolution you start with, the greater your options for cropping are, and the more resolution you'll have left over once you've cropped. This is a 36 million pixel image to start with, and I've cropped in just to this section of the image, and I've still got a 10 million pixel image. So even though it may have started as a huge, great 36 million pixel image, even by the time I've cropped in, the image would still be about this big. Okay? You can often also, within your camera, choose different resolutions. We'll come on to that in more depth later on as to whether it may or may not make any sense. But essentially, more resolution you've got, bigger images you'll have to play with, and the more options you've got for things like cropping. So you can't avoid the basic rule that the higher resolution image you start with, the more you've got to play with. Now what gets confusing is that the image size isn't actually fixed. Now, of course, this isn't related to the view on screen. You can see here we've got an image in Photoshop. I can zoom out of it quite happily, and I can zoom into it. And in doing so, I'm not altering the image at all. I'm simply changing my view of it and pulling away or going closer in. What I'm referring to about the image size not being fixed is something called PPI, pixels per inch, or occasionally dots per inch, or occasionally pixels per centimetre. I'm sure you can appreciate there's a difference between imperial metric, but they amount to the same thing. All this refers to, very, very simply, is how many pixels there are to each inch of the image. Just to give you a very rough idea, if I go right in, I'm now at 200, 300, 400, 500, 600%, you can now see the actual pixels this image is made up of. Okay, so there you are, right at the grassroots level of the image, each pixel. So pixels per inch refers to how many of those are covering an inch. Now obviously the more pixels per inch, the more fine the detail you can depict. Imagine at the other end of the scale, if you had simply 1 pixel per inch, your image would look pretty blocky. Now the sizes in the example video above were all at 300 pixels per inch, which is a fairly standard resolution for printing images up to about 16 by 20 inches or so. So more pixels per inch means the image will look better with smoother and finer detail. However, here's the catch. PPI isn't fixed. It can be easily altered in software like Photoshop, which I shall do now. I'll go to my image menu, image size, and I'll bring up a little dialog box. Now straight away we can see exactly what I showed you on that card earlier. We have a width of 41 centimeters, height of 27 centimeters, and a resolution of 300 pixels per inch. Exactly what I showed you on that card in the earlier video, because this is an image straight out of my Nikon D4. Now a bit of basic maths will help you realize that if you take the same resolution image from a camera and reduce the number of pixels per inch, you'll end up with a physically larger image from the same file. So here we are at 300 pixels per inch. If I reduce this number to 72 ppi, which is a very common screen resolution, 72, look how the other numbers change. Suddenly it's now 173 centimeters wide, not 40 or so, and 115 centimeters tall, because what we've done is spread the same number of pixels out across a larger area, because there are now less pixels to each inch. What I haven't done is actually altered the underlying basic resolution of the image. If you look up here, the dimensions are still 4928 pixels by 3280 pixels. And if I reset this to 300, back to where we started, you notice those don't change. Now common sense will tell you you can only spread things out or combine things up to a point before quality starts to deteriorate a little bit. Of course, if you kept spreading things out further and further and further, each pixel would have to cover a larger area and things would start to look very, very blocky. So generally speaking, that explains why you can't keep enlarging images before the quality starts to fall apart. However, you'll be surprised at how low resolution some quite large images are. Next time you get the chance when you're out in the street, try and look quite closely at an advertising billboard, a huge, what's called a 48-sheet poster. If you can look closely at it, you'll realize that it's actually quite a blocky image, that there seem to be not that many pixels per inch. The reason for this is actually very, very obvious. When you're standing that close, you can't take in the whole image, but you're able to see the detail. If you're standing far enough back to take in the whole image, you can't see the detail. You can't see that it's made up of quite blocky, low-resolution pixels. To avoid confusion, if you want to be precise when describing resolution, always either list how many pixels, this measurement up here, because we know this is fixed, or specifically say something like 20 by 30 centimeters at 300 ppi. So what's the catch? Because there's always a catch, isn't there? You're waiting for me to tell you about the catch. You know how this game works. Well, bigger's not always better. In my professional experience, having started long before digital was on the scene and worked my way up through some very basic digital cameras to some of the incredibly advanced stuff we've got nowadays, I think quality images in terms of resolution start anywhere from about 10 million pixels onwards. You don't need to go chasing these enormously high numbers just to get quality images. And in fact, the more resolution you have, there are a few payoffs. For one thing, the image size, the file size, is going to be considerably bigger. Understandably, the 36 million pixel images off my D800 that I'm filming this on are much larger file sizes than the 10 million pixel images off this. Okay, that means I need bigger memory cards. I also need a camera fast enough to deal with that, because the cameras themselves, within their processors, as they take the data from the image sensor and put it out to the memory card, have what's called a buffer. And the larger the file sizes you're using, the quicker this buffer will fill up and the longer it will take to write the images out to the card. It's one of the reasons why cameras like this D4, although it's a few years old now, are very, very expensive because they have a huge, great buffer in them. They're not particularly high resolution, but they can fire off at loads and loads of frames a second, pushing lots and lots of information through and spit it out quite fast. By comparison, you might have a higher resolution camera than this, let's say, but it'll go much slower because the buffer's much smaller. The other aspect about larger resolution images that you won't discover until you've played around quite a lot on your computer is how much longer larger resolution images can take to process. It varies from computer to computer because of how powerful your processor, your RAM and your hard drive are, but basically the bigger the image size, the more processing it will take on your computer to do anything to it. Now, that might not matter too much if you're working on 1 or 2 images. But if you're somebody like me and you frequently shoot hundreds of images a day, sometimes even thousands of images a day, if it takes, say, 10 seconds to process a 36 million pixel image out from a RAW file to a JPEG, more details about that later, and it takes, say, 3 seconds to process a 16 million pixel file the same way, then I will get 3 times as many of these done in the time it took 36 million pixel ones to get done. If we're talking hundreds of images, that can be the difference between actually getting to go to bed that night or sitting up waiting all night for it to finish processing. Okay, so bigger isn't always better. So there you go, the absolute basics of resolution, megapixels and PPI. Now I appreciate it can get quite confusing, particularly that PPI bit. You might want to go back and watch that again. It caused me a lot of confusion when I first started out. Next week we're going to talk about sensor size and pixel density and things like that, get things even more complicated. But for now, hit like if you like what I'm doing, subscribe for notifications, and obviously if I've missed something out, you'd like some clarification, stick a comment below and I'll do my very best to answer it. Otherwise, see you next week when we talk about sensor size.